Hey, Speedwinghere here, and today I wanted to talk about the difficulty of the Fire Emblem games. Now, when it comes to difficulty in Fire Emblem, quite often people will use a tier list system, A, B, C, D, but that doesn't really tell you much. It's kind of difficult to just look at a tier list and understand what this actually means. I think a much better system is to look at both the difficulty and the fairness of a Fire Emblem game. Because a game that can be considered very difficult actually isn't that difficult, it's just what it expects from the player is quite unfair. I first saw this graph used by Oof776 a while ago, and I think this is a wonderful way to talk about the games. So I'm now going to go through each of the games and give my general thoughts on them. So I'm going to skip Fire Emblem 1 to 3 just because I've not played them that much. I don't know enough about them to confidently talk about them. Sorry, Gaiden fans. Okay, so starting off, we have Genealogy. Now, Genealogy is not a very difficult game. Sigurd just kind of sweeps Act 1, and then Act 2 is your super children with the holy weapons. So I'm probably gonna have to put it somewhere around here on the scale. There are definitely games that are a lot easier than it, but for the most part, when you understand its systems, it's a bit of a snooze. And that comes on to fairness. So the systems. I mean, Genealogy is pretty fair for the most part. However, there are a few things in it that it doesn't really explain. You know, like the jealousy system. The game kind of expects you to arena grind up weapons. But it never throws anything too horrific in your face. You will be able to deal with most of what the game presents to you without having lots of prior knowledge of the game. So I'd maybe put it like here. Now I might move some of these around as we go through just because I'll be able to look at the games a lot clearer when I can see where I've placed the other ones. Okay, Frasia. Now, Frasia, in my opinion, and this is going to be very controversial, is one of the easiest games in the entire series. I have no idea where this concept of Frasia being some elitist, if you're good at Fire Emblem, you play Frasia and you're good at Frasia, comes from. The stat caps are 20, you can stop your units getting crit, you can pretty much just glide through the entire game with next to no issues. Now, where I think this whole elitist Frasia very, very difficult comes from is how unfair it is. Frasia is a very, very unfair game that expects you to understand a lot of systems that it never explains to you, ever. You can get soft-locked, you can have all kinds of terrible, terrible things happen to you because you just weren't expecting them. The game relies on you to have prior knowledge or to be following a guide to actually really get through many parts of it. So for that reason, I have to put it in very unfair. I'm not going to put it in total unfair because, you know, while the game doesn't describe many of its systems to you, once you understand them, they are pretty decent. It's just, it expects a lot out of the player. It expects you to do a lot of research, a lot of homework, and then you'll understand it. So I think I'll put it about here. And honestly, I'm going to put Genealogy a little more difficult, because Genealogy is definitely much more difficult than Frasia, once you understand it. Binding Blade. It's the hardest of the GBA titles, but is that because it's unfair? So, Binding Blade, it has the shaky hit rates. The infamous Binding Blade hit rates are pretty unfair. I mean, you are going to be facing really nasty hit chances on people. However, this can be mitigated with supports, but then again, the game never really explains to you why or how that happens. I would maybe put Binding Blade like here. I mean, it's actually pretty fair. It is a GBA game, and the GBA games are relatively fair. I would maybe place it around here. This might be subject to change. This one, for sure, might get moved around. All right, FE7, really not too difficult at all. Probably similar levels to Genealogy. Once you use the right units in the right way, you are just going to kind of rush through the game, as it were. How fair is it? I don't think it's that fair. FE7 has a lot of nasty status staves, which honestly I'm now remembering FE6 has as well. So let's put FE6 like here. FE7 has a lot of nasty status staves, a lot of enemy spam. I mean, the game kind of expects you to take your paladin and put them on a fort and wait. I mean, is that unfair? I suppose that's unfair, because like if you don't do that, if you try and play in a different way, you get very badly punished for it. It has Lin mode though, and Lin mode must increase the fairness quite a lot, because it's an actual comprehensive tutorial, which a lot of the games don't have, or you know, their tutorials are pretty lacking in comparison. I'd say Lin mode's one of the most comprehensible tutorials. The hit rates are a lot better than FE6. Maybe I'll put it here for now. I'll put it here for now. Sacred Stones. All right. Probably the easiest game in the franchise. However, it's very fair, I'd say. There is... I'm struggling to think of many moments in FE8 where you just think, oh, come on. Like, most of the time, you can deal with everything the game throws at you. You have the tools. I don't know if it's completely, perfectly fair. I don't think any game is, but it's definitely very, very, very fair, despite its difficulty. So I think we'll put it, like, here. It doesn't explain supports, but like basically none of the games describe supports, so I don't know how much of a factor that actually is. Let's put it here for now. Path of Radiance. So I'm doing this graph based on highest difficulty, and this makes Path of Radiance kind of hard to place, because are we talking about Maniac mode or are we talking about hard mode? Maniac mode is Japanese only. If we're just talking about hard mode, Path of Radiance is Sacred Stones tier. It is just a complete walk in the park. You don't really have to think. It's enemy phase the game. You just have your unit with very high defense, put them forwards. Or you have Oscar Ike with supports in the way that they just dodge everything. So if we were talking about hard mode, I'd be putting it maybe not quite Sacred Stones tier, maybe that's me being a bit mean, but Frasia tier probably. Very, you know, very straightforward, very simple to understand. If we're talking Maniac mode, I would bump it up a bit. Not too much, because it's not... Maniac mode isn't necessarily more difficult, it's just more enemy spam. It's a lot of enemy spam. The game just kind of throws waves upon waves upon waves of enemies at you. There's some pretty nasty points in the game as well. I mean, I still need to decide whether I'm talking about Maniac or hard. Let's just talk about Maniac, because for, you know, most people, if they're going to be playing the highest difficulty of Path of Radiance, are probably going to get a Japanese run with Maniac. So if we're talking Maniac, I'll put it like this high. I think the game's pretty unfair. I would place it here. Radiant Dawn. More difficult than Path of Radiance, I'd say, even though it doesn't have its Maniac mode, because the hard mode is effectively Maniac mode. I put it maybe here. It has a lot of interesting systems. The game does describe itself pretty well. You know, it does tell you what you need to do. It's less enemy spammy than Path of Radiance, although some of the maps are still pretty horrible. There's things like the bridge map. But it is on relative. I'd say it's a lot more fair than Path of Radiance. Path of Radiance does just throw things like Clash don't exist in Radiant Dawn. I would put Radiant Dawn. It's much easier than FE6, to be fair. Maybe here. Shadow Dragon. This was actually my first game in the series. I'm a big fan of Shadow Dragon. However, H5 is a difficulty that's often talked about as being really, really tough and really, really difficult to play. I don't agree with this at all. I think Shadow Dragon is actually a lot easier than people say it is. It's just a lot of the so-called difficulty comes from it being unfair. Once you have your general set up, and I'm not just talking about Wolf or Sedgar. If we're talking about Wolf and Sedgar, the difficulty's down here. But I'm just going to talk in general terms. No pun intended. You will get to a point in Shadow Dragon where you will be turning someone into a general, and that person will then just be sat on a fort, cleaning out the enemy waves. The game is pretty horrible with its reinforcements. There are a lot of reinforcements in this game. You do kind of need to wiki game a little bit with it. I mean, the start of H5, you're expected to pretty much break the boss weapons. I don't see this as being difficult. I see this as just being frustrating and unfair. I would probably put Shadow Dragon H5 around... No, I think it's more unfair than this, honestly. It's more unfair than Path of Radiance. I'm going to actually move Path of Radiance up a bit in fairness. It's not that unfair. Shadow Dragon probably sits about here. Because, like I said, a lot of the so-called difficulty of H5 does just boil down to, oh, this enemy spam, there's so much enemy spam, how do I deal with this? But once you have your general, you deal with it by pressing wait, end turn. New mystery! Lunatic Reverse is considered one of the biggest challenges in the series. Now, is this true? How difficult is Lunatic Reverse, actually? It's pretty difficult. It is actually pretty difficult. I will give Lunatic Reverse that. It is pretty difficult. However, it's really difficult to rate Lunatic Reverse because it's so different from every other difficulty in the series in the fact that it kind of turns Fire Emblem into more of a puzzle game. You have to make the right moves in the right order, and if you do not make the right moves in the right order, you will lose. However, if you do make the right moves in the right order, you will succeed. I think it's actually pretty fair in that aspect. It doesn't mean it's fun. Fun isn't on this graph, and if fun was on this graph, things would be placed very differently. But I think it's actually pretty fair. Lunatic Reverse is about you mastering your knowledge of the games and its systems and how it works, and it's not really throwing that much at you. I mean, I guess if I put Shadow Dragon that low, maybe I'll bump Shadow Dragon up a little bit in fairness. But yeah, Lunatic Reverse, it's pretty hard, but it's also pretty fair. I think around here is good, because even with the whole concept of, oh well, you need to make the right moves, you still need to have the skill to know what the right moves are. So I'd put New Mystery like here. Lunatic Reverse, of course. Oh boy, Awakening Lunatic Plus. Now, on a standard tier list, this would probably be in the #1 spot. This is often considered the most difficult thing in the whole franchise. But is it actually? No, in my opinion. I don't actually think Lunatic Plus is that difficult. It's just unbelievably unfair. It is the most unfair experience in the whole series. Randomized enemy skills, same turn reinforcement spam. It's just miserable. It's just completely miserable. I don't think you getting one-shot by something that you didn't know was about to appear, even if the game says, oh, Crom, my lord, the wyverns are coming, you still don't know what square they're coming out of, and you don't know what their ranges are, and you don't know what randomized skills the game's going to give them. It's horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. Now, in terms of actually how difficult it is, it's Awakening. It's a Crom and Robin fest. If you want to, you can just Nosferatu spam through the entire thing. But the problem with Lunatic Plus, without DLC, so you're not getting the XP grinding chapter, you do have to get to that point. Now, if you're not using the DLC EXP grinding, Lunatic Plus is really rough at the start. You have to play pretty optimally in order to get your Crom and Robin up to the point where they can start doing stuff. However, like I said, a lot of the difficulty does just come from kind of bullshit, in my opinion. So I'm going to put it maybe here. Once you do get going, everything is fine, and you don't even have to really think anymore. You just press end turn and enemy phase everything, and you're completely okay. But you do have to get to that point, and it does take a while. But yeah, in terms of fairness, I wish I could... Oh, it's not what I wanted to pull. Come on. Not what I wanted to pull. Okay, never mind. I won't do my dramatic pull. Here we go. If I could, I would put like it off screen in terms of unfairness. I hate how unfair Lunatic Plus is. Really, really nasty. Hopefully they never design a difficulty the same way ever again. Okay, so we get onto Fates, and I'm going to do all three of them separately because they're three very different games. Birthright. So Birthright has this strange reputation where people go, oh, Birthright is so easy. It's baby's first Fire Emblem. But is it? Birthright Lunatic is not actually that easy. It's just easy compared to Conquest and Rev. There are still some pretty difficult systems for you to interact with, and some of the later maps can be pretty tough. However, you do have Ryoma, who is your kind of get-out-of-jail-free card for a lot of the game. But I wouldn't put it like down here by any means. You still need to understand how Fates plays, and you need to understand how to reclass, how to give skills. Like, it's not that. And there is a lot of enemy spam. The problem is it's an enemy phase game, and I don't feel comfortable putting enemy phase games too high up on difficulty. I know Awakening is there, but it's kind of a special case. I would probably put Birthright. It's easier than H5 Shadow Dragon. Now, how fair is it? I think it's relatively unfair at points. It kind of just wants you to sit there and spam Ryoma, and if you don't, you kind of get punished for it. There's a lot of characters that, while you can make them work, it requires so much effort and knowledge of the game. I think it's probably less fair than Binding Blade. I'm actually going to move Binding Blade even further across. I'm going to put Birthright here for now. I might come back to it when I talk about Conquest and Rev. Conquest! Oh my goodness. Conquest Lunatic, in my opinion, is probably one of the pinnacles of the series in both fairness and difficulty. The game explains all its systems to you. I mean, we're talking about Fate systems. I have to move Birthright over here. Fate's systems are just so wonderful. All the reclassing, the skills, like how you utilize your resources in terms of the My Castle. There is so much going on, and there's so much for the player to interact with. Like, the thing about Conquest is whenever you lose a map in Conquest, it's incredibly rare that you think, oh, for goodness sake, I can't believe I just lost that map. You're usually thinking, I messed up there. Oh, I should have done something differently. It's very rare that you're left with a sour taste in your mouth, or at least for me, that's mostly the case. There are a couple of moments where you just think, oh no, but like, usually that's just because you're unprepared. You've not prepared properly. I would put Conquest Lunatic, I don't know if I can give it a perfect. It's not perfect, but it's very, very, very fair. The game, Lunatic especially, is very well balanced. You will notice that when units come in, they can contribute in a very specific way right off the bat. Units feel like they're leveled appropriately for where you should be at each point of the game. There's always a way to deal with everything the game throws at you. I'm going to place it here. It's probably the most difficult and fair game in the series, in my opinion. But I'm probably a little bit biased, as it is one of my favorites. Wee woo, wee woo. Peak coming through. Fire Emblem Revelations. Wow, what a wonderful, wonderful game. Now, you're probably expecting me to put Rev down really low in fairness, but I actually think Rev is relatively fair. Yes, every map has a gimmick, and sometimes those gimmicks feel unfun. But is unfun unfair? I don't think so. The game gives you the tools to work with everything. You just have to have very, very deep knowledge of Fates in order to deal with it. Things like Rev having low amount of gold. You know, to a kind of normal player, you might just see that and go, oh, it feels really unfair that I don't have much gold to buy things. But actually what Rev does is it gives you so many droppable items, it kind of expects you to sell some of them for gold. There's things like that in Rev that to the untrained eye would probably be seen as pretty unfair. And, you know, I guess for people playing it for the first time, that would be pretty unfair. So I might have to put it on this side. I mean, it's gimmicks. The whole concept of Rev is every map has a gimmick. Some of those gimmicks are a lot better than others. You know, there are the elevator map, the snow map are pretty brutal. The snow map is actually pretty unfair for a first time playing because you don't know where the enemies are in the snow. But then again, if you approach it slowly, that doesn't matter as much. I think Rev is very hard in terms of difficulty. Not as hard as Conquest. Once you get yourself set up, you know, you have all the units in the game, you can get some, you know, you can have all the royals. Is it same level as Lunatic Reverse? Probably not. Probably a little lower than that. And it's less fair than both Conquest and Birthright, in my opinion, but it's still relatively fair. There's so many systems for the player to interact with, you know. I would put it here. Echoes! What a beautiful, beautiful game, but sadly we're not talking about how the game looks in this, so difficulty. It's pretty easy. Echoes is pretty easy. It's very simplistic because it's a very faithful remake of Gaiden. It's pretty easy. Most of the maps are just squares. It just comes down to who has bigger stats and what weapon, what one item do you give your characters. It's pretty easy. Is it as easy as FE7 and Genealogy? Probably. Yeah, probably. Now, how fair is it, though? It's pretty unfair. Witches warping on you, Celica's whole side of the story with kind of the desert chapters and the sand chapters, it's nowhere near as unfair as Frasia. I'm going to move Frasia over because Frasia is really unfair in terms of what it expects you to know. Echoes is pretty unfair. I mean, you can see where things are coming. I guess with some knowledge of the game, it's kind of hard to place. I'd say Arm's side of the story is a lot more fair than Celica's, but we kind of got to use them both. I'd put it maybe here. Free houses! Okay, free houses maddening. It's pretty tough, but is it actually tough? No, not really. It's just incredibly unfair. Maddening free houses is just horrible. It's just horrible. There's so many weird things like same turn reinforcements and things like after the post time skip chapter where if you haven't recruited certain units and trained them up, they just appear and instantly die. There's a lot of game over conditions. Oh, game over conditions. I haven't been factoring that in. Radiant Dawn has so many game over conditions. I'm going to put it here. All right. Free houses maddening. I don't think it's actually that difficult at the base of it. There are a lot of systems for the player to work with. You can, you know, put your units through certain classes to increase their base stats. You can have Edelgard and Dimitri on their respective routes pretty much just warp them in and just break everything. I would say that a lot of the difficulty just comes from bullshit out of control of the player. I'm gonna put it maybe. It is still hard though. It is still hard. It's not a complete snooze. But I mean, it expects you to interact with a lot of the stuff in the monastery. Like you have to do all the singing and the fishing and the gardening. I mean, you don't have to, but if you want the game to be an easier experience, you pretty much have to interact with it. It's harder than Binding Blade. But then Awakening Lunatic Plus is probably at a similar level because, like I said, once you get Robin online. Yeah, I would probably put Free Houses Maddening here. It's a very, very unfair thing. It's one of the most unfair difficulties in the series, in my opinion. And finally, Engage. Oh, this is going to be a bit of a controversial one. Please pay attention to no DLC. No DLC. Engage Maddening is actually very, very, very challenging. A lot of people will say, oh, Engage Maddening was a complete snooze, but they used all the DLC chapters. They got like 18 chapters worth of experience, loads of broken rings, can trivialize tons of the maps. Like, they had a silver card, so they had third less gold for the whole game. Engage Maddening without the DLC is pretty difficult. It's not Conquest levels. Is it new mystery levels? Maybe. I'd say it's more difficult than Rev, but not by a lot. Now, Engage is incredibly fair, like really fair. There are so many systems for you to interact with, so many different ways to approach everything, all the different combinations of classes and ring combinations, what skills you give to people. There are loads of tools for the player to deal with. And if you play it on Maddening, you'd be surprised. The game is pretty well balanced. I mean, that's why they force you into playing fixed mode, which is very controversial. You know, a lot of people don't like that. But the reason they did that is because they were worried that if the player got screwed, they wouldn't be able to beat it on a first time. So I would say Engage is very fair and it's pretty hard. I think New Mystery maybe edges it out slightly. I might put Rev down a little bit. I would say Engage sits around here. Now, the first 3/4 of the game of Engage Maddening, I would probably put like here. It's unbelievably fair. The game gives you the tools to succeed, and you just have to use them correctly. However, the last quarter of Maddening, some of the enemy units, their stats are pretty crazy. They can out-level you quite a lot. The hit chances start getting a bit low on things like Griffin Knights and Wolf Knights, maybe like 60-70% hit. Now, you can remedy this with, you know, skills and engraves, but I don't know. There's entrap staves, there's Griss's chapter in the dark, which, you know, you do have the ability to light it up, but it will probably catch new players off guard. I think Engage maybe here. And there you have it. Probably some pretty controversial placements. I'm sure there's going to be people mad that I called the game that they think is really hard not very hard, and vice versa. But there you have it. That's my objective opinion. I think this is a good way of looking at difficulty, because quite often a game isn't actually difficult. It's just difficult because of the crap that the game throws at you. But let me know down below what you think you would put certain games at, and whether you think this is a good way of looking at the games. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.